There's a beef between Brazil and the US. The EU, China and several other countries banned meat imports from Brazil in March over a tainted meat scandal. The US did not. Instead, it began testing all of the meat arriving from Brazil. Since then, 11%, about 862,000 kilograms of meat, has been barred from entering the US. That number was too high for the US government. Now it says no Brazilian meat will be coming in. Critics say the ban could be political, an example of President Donald Trump putting America first. US Senator Heidi Heitkamp sent a letter to Trump asking for imports of Brazilian beef to be halted, and warns the president that any bad Brazilian meat could also endanger the reputation of US beef producers. Brazil is the world's biggest red meat and poultry exporter. The industry brings in more than $12 billion a year, and the loss of the US market is a blow to Brazil's meat industry. Brazil exports 20% of the world's beef and 40% of its chicken. Beef, poultry and pork accounted for close to 10% of the country's export revenues last year. Brazil could lose $1.5 billion in meat exports this year. But not everyone in Brazil is worried. One economist says Brazil has overcome worse and became the world's biggest exporter after a global foot-and-mouth outbreak in 2007.
It took a lot of time for Brazil to assert itself as an international brand. Several years ago, we had a foot and a mouth disease problem that allowed us to make a name for ourselves.
Despite these glimmers of confidence, the stakes are high for Brazilian beef. Adefemi Akinsanya, TRT World.
So for more on what the ban means for Brazil, Sam Cowie is in Sao Paulo. Sam, thanks ever so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about what the reaction is where you are amongst the beef industry to this ban.
Well, what we've seen so far is that publicly traded meat companies on the Brazilian stock index, or Bovespa, we've seen the stocks have, fallen. We've also seen the Agriculture Minister, Brairo Maggi. He is on a plane at the moment going to the United States to try and resolve this crisis. He put out on his Twitter that he very much valued the relationship between the United States and the trade between the two nations regarding fresh beef. So it's worth remembering here that the ban has just been put on fresh beef products from Brazil to the United States. Elsewhere, we've seen other prominent agricultural secretaries in Maggi's camp saying that they believe that this decision was taken through an excess of zeal, whatever that means. So, but basically, this decision was taken following a corruption scandal in March where it was alleged that federal health inspectors were being bribed to let spoilt meat pass. And since then, we've seen vigorous checking of Brazilian beef going into the United States.
Right. Now, the US actually only accounts for a very small proportion of Brazilian beef exports. So why is this ban such a big deal?
Yeah, that's right. So from the start of this year up until now, Brazil, American purchase of Brazilian beef have only actually accounted for about 2%. But last year it was more like 0.1%. So what we've seen there is it's a growing market. But more than the numbers, it's what it represents symbolically. Brazil could suffer from this decision. If Brazil gets a bad reputation for its beef, it could suffer. We could see Brazil lose market share worldwide. At the moment, Brazil exports the vast majority of its fresh beef to China and Hong Kong and Saudi Arabia. And if those markets were to follow suit with the United States, then Brazil would definitely have like a big problem on its hands. And this is an economy which is struggling as it is.
Right, indeed. Now, you mentioned earlier the corruption scandal surrounding beef. How is the investigation into that scandal going?
What we've seen so far, we've seen dozens of federal health inspectors were actually fired, and basically, what we saw is that it was actually only a very small number of slaughterhouses which were suspected to have been involved in this scandal. It was something like 31 out of more than 5,000. Those slaughterhouses were closed temporarily, and vigorous checks were put in place. But again, this is all to do with it's more about reputation of Brazil's beef products than the actual numbers here. And like I say, if other countries were to follow suit of the United States and assert bans again, then Brazil really would be in trouble. We saw the European Union and we saw the Chinese bans lifted after, several days following the last scandal. So Brazil's really in damage control mode right now to make sure that these bans aren't put on again.
Indeed. Sam Cowie in Sao Paulo, thank you very much indeed for that.